Okay. Ready for another speech redo. Back when COVID wasn't a thing, after my debate squad's Friday night rounds, we would go to the coveted Golden Arches, McDonald's. Almost any time or any place this McDonald's was, I would always ask for one soft serve ice cream cone. And without skipping a beat, I would be told that the machines were not working. Every single McDonald's we went to. It started to make me wonder if there was anything as ineffective as a McDonald's ice cream machine. And I mean, those truly top the charts. But after investing my effort and my 30-minute prep window for this speech into the cold world of international institutions and politics, I've come to the realization that international institutions are the cherry on top when it comes to ineffectivity. One area in which researchers suggest that politics and international institutions can improve is in representation, as the old institutions oftentimes can lack proper representation of class, gender, or ironically, worldview. So today, let's serve up some answers on how our international institutions can come to a more diverse institution. First, let's talk about the rocky roads of the humble beginnings of some of our international institutions. I'd like to talk about the United Nations. It came into existence in 1954 with 50 representative countries and the United Nations Conference. All of the representatives from all 50 countries were men of majoritively white and wealthy backgrounds. A Harvard paper states that due to a lack of representation from both smaller countries and a diverse set of individuals, the institution had a lack of proper coordination, which then created rules that often lacked institutional diversity that limited the function of the UN. Primarily, we can see how the structure of the United Nations is biased towards larger global superpowers like the US when it comes to things like the Security Council. The Security Council allows 5 countries, including Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the US, to veto any legislation proposed in the United Nations. A source from CNN tells us that it's giving these superpowers a large advantage over smaller countries and the global sphere creates issues with lack of representation. Secondly, NASA. Well, NASA is an independent agency of the US government, not identified as an international institution. It does engage in multilateral agreements and treaties similar to an international institution. When it started off, it was just like the United Nations, a well established institution by primarily white men. And if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, you know that there were individuals behind the scenes that made those a lot of those projects and sending a man to the moon again and sending a man to the moon, although their work lacked proper representations historically. This created a conflict that perpetuated the idea that women, and especially Black women, were incapable of achieving enough academic success to be placed in the same position as their white counterparts. Next, let's banana split some of the issues our international institutions have created from their lack of diversity. Back on to the United Nations. Earlier, we talked about how the United Nations were founded on a proper founded their proper institution on a lack of diverse group and individuals that resulted in less functionality of the institution. Throughout the history of the United Nations, we can see how this representation has created a trend over time. As a source from the Human Rights Pulse tells us that in late September of this past year, when the UN General Assembly convened to discuss a litany of issues, only 11 out of 196 speakers across the entire event were women, even citing a lack of general representation by smaller countries in the discussions. We can see how the humble beginnings of this institution have led to more how the humble beginnings of this institution being majoritively represented by men meant that there are more international bodies being affected by the lack of representation and not being effectively treated in multilateral agreements and having their impact and their countries stance taken into account. Secondly, I'd like to talk about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The creation of NAFTA was not only frustrating because both the United States, Canada, and Mexico lacked proper acknowledgement about diverse issues that faced each country's trading policies. We can see how the lack of engagement and diversity in multilateral institutions has affected treaties like NAFTA into being largely unable to craft and understand something that would effectively create a diverse understanding of both countries. The United States even presumed information about Mexico's economic output, illegal activities, and ended up preempting those in the treaty itself, which made it less effective. So, lastly, let's look at some concrete solutions to addressing diversity in our international institutions, not only on the front of gender and racial representation, but also on the front of representing smaller and less economically independent countries. So first, we can address this issue by engaging more non-democratic countries. As a lot of non-democratic countries are oftentimes smaller, we can see how democratic countries can affect non-democratic countries by engaging them in international institutions, which will drive them to be more diverse and democratic, because a lot of these non-democratic countries often lack diversity in their own governments. A source from CNN also tells us that limiting the power of dominant nations can also reap a lot of institutional benefits, as sometimes power projecting countries like the US, Russia, or China often lack diversity because of its power projections on other countries. Things like diversity or more diversity can often be represented as a lack of power, which forces the US, Russia, and China, as well as other power projecting nations, to not engage in diversity. Well, inclusion might fix our might not fix our McDonald's ice cream cone maker. It can address a litany of issues on our international front, including diversity in our international institutions.